All right, so thank you everyone for attending Agile 2020. Please give a virtual round of applause to Darsweil. There you go. Very nice. All right, so Darsweil, let's go ahead and get this started. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend some time talking about agile cultural change this morning, embracing the generation of technological disruption in the next 20 years. And truly, the next 20 years are going to be remarkable, and I'm going to cover that during the course of this. And so, welcome to this. In this discussion, what I'm really going to start with is the necessity for organizations to embrace agility, and in particular around these two areas. I think it's always helpful for the purpose of the conversation for us to agree on some terms, and you may say, boy, these are really basic terms, but for a group of Agilists, but I'm a big fan of just making sure everybody's on the same page. And so really the whole question around agility is the ability to think and understand quickly, and the ability to move quickly and easily. And appreciate, please, that I'm thinking about organizations. I'm not just thinking about teams. I'm not just thinking about the technology or the software development or the project management part of an organization. I'm talking about how do we get the entire organization to move quickly. And then we're talking about culture and share. And so you need a shared system of assumptions, values, and beliefs, which governs how people behave. And generally speaking, what I find, and let me tell you at this point, I'm not a traditional Agilist. I'm a businessman. Okay, I'm a business person. I'm a consultant. I've worked inside large corporations on the business side, not on the tech side. Is that there is a fundamental lack of an appreciation of what it is that the Agile manifesto or what people do in this space. As a matter of fact, when I talk to people, business people about Agile, they don't know what I'm talking about. And certainly, if I'm dressed like this, in an outfit like this, and I say I'm focused on Agile, I said, oh, so you're in the gym, or just some sort of athletic endeavor that you're involved in. And so there's not any sort of shared consciousness around agility, although it has become a bit of a buzzword in the C-suite, but it's not fully appreciated. And obviously, if you're going to be Agile and you're going to have a shared set of assumptions and a culture, you really want to be able to do that in this environment, certainly around the ability to innovate. And so you've got to be able to introduce new methods, ideas, and products. And a key premise here for me is that you've got to leverage your entire workforce to make that happen. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here in terms of where I'm headed. So what is the problem we're attempting to solve? And obviously, I'm operating under the presumption that there is a problem. And that fundamental problem is, how do we get organizations to manage through what I view as unprecedented disruptions? And as a matter of fact, I think anyone who disagrees with me, and of course we're taking questions along the way, I'm all ears to have additional conversations about this. But really is, how can organizations manage all the unprecedented disruption that's taking place? And we're really going to focus on two areas. The first one is what's called the fourth industrial revolution. And if we were in a room together, I'd ask who'd ever heard of it, and who's familiar with the fourth industrial revolution. These are the core components of it. The term fourth industrial revolution was coined by Klaus Schwab, who's the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Council. Those guys that meet in Davos every year. The technology that is coming on stream is unprecedented. The only thing that would even compare would be the Industrial Revolution, when we got things like the automobile and the light bulb. But the notion that robots that are going to be able to operate without human interaction is truly something that, other than on a manufacturing floor, you don't see. But these things can very much be in any work environment and in our households. And cybersecurity is kind of a given. Augmented reality, we're just a step away from augmented reality with this virtual conference. I mean, a couple of years from now, we'll all be wearing goggles and walking around in a room and actually meeting each other. So tremendous potential change taking place there. I'm not going to read all of those, but they are the core of this incredible change in technological impact. But what's most important to understand is that none of this technology is worth a darn a damn if there aren't people that have the insights, understandings, and perspectives to be able to leverage it for the benefit of our organization. And this is not just technologists, this is people who are true lay people that are interacting either with this technology or are using or becoming in contact with the information that is coming out of all this technology. And so what are they supposed to do with it? What's relevant, what's not relevant? How do you make those sort of determinations? And what's really important to understand is that the flow of information through companies is just going to be too fast, too big for a person or a small group of people to be able to analyze it, interpret it, make decisions on it, delegate it, and see what the performance and outcome of that is for them to go through that cycle again. So that historical process that we see in hierarchical organizations is going to be entirely too slow. And we already see that happening because today the average age of a Fortune 500 company is only 15 years, is less than 15 years. And 20 or 30 years ago, it was like 50 years that you'd been on the Fortune 500. So technological companies, those that have operate with greater agility, are beating out all the other players. And what's really important to understand is that there's going to be more technological change in the next 20 years than there's been in the last 300. And I would really say than there has been in human history. I mean, this is going to be so dramatically different than anything we've ever experienced in the human dynamic. And again, these are assumptions that are coming out of the World Economic Forum. This is what they're saying. These are not things that I'm saying. And what's also important to understand is that the pace of this change is accelerating. So what we're feeling today at this moment is slower than it'll feel like a week, a year, or 2 years, or 5 years from now. And so how are organizations going to be able to address this? How do you remain relevant in your chosen market with those sorts of dynamics taking place? So then that's the kind of the technological part of this 20-year challenge that we're confronted with. Now let's talk about the generational. And we've got 5 generations that are currently in the workplace. And the boomers and Generation X in particular see the world completely different than millennials and Generation Z. Now, there's a lot of folks who like to criticize the millennials and they like to criticize Gen Z. And if we were in a room together, I'd want to know what the split is between the two. But what I will say to you is that for those of you who are boomers, who either have kids or grandkids who are in the millennial generation, we raised them. We got exactly what we wanted. We wanted them to be dynamic. We wanted them to ask questions. And if you stop and think about it, so frequently, I'm sorry, I'm reading something on the screen that was flashing at me. I'll move that away so I'm not distracted. And if you think about it, we would have the youngest person in the family. We'd ask them, so what do you want to do, Tommy? What do you want to do, Mary? And they would say what they wanted, and the whole family would do it. And now suddenly we're in an environment that gets to the workplace, and we're like, why don't they just sit in the corner and recognize they're young and recognize they don't know anything and recognize the fact that they got to pay their dues just like we did? Well, they don't think they have to pay their dues because that's not how they were raised. They weren't raised to think that way. And quite frankly, they're doing corporations a favor by saying, listen, if you're not going to make this a meaningful experience for me, I'm leaving. Gallup does a survey every year of employee engagement. And the statistics are about 3 out of 10 employees are engaged. 5 out of 10 of them are just hanging around sightseeing. And 2 out of 10 are literally trying to sink the company. The millennials and Gen Zs are saying, I just won't stay. Isn't it better to get that kind of dynamic feedback from your workforce and say, I'm not going to sit here and just collect a paycheck. I, in effect, want to do something meaningful. And so we're having to come to grips with that. This disruption is an opportunity, particularly given all the technology that's coming on stream, if we can change and recognize that the cultures have to change inside organizations. Fact of the matter is, millennials are now 50% of the managers, and they just have a completely different perspective around work-life balance. And there's three key things that they're looking for. They're looking to be inside purpose-driven organizations. Tell me why I should care about the organization. Tell me how the organization cares about society, and you can hook me. It's not about the money. It's about why should I care. They want mastery of skills and talents. They're interested in learning and knowing and being actively involved in what's taking place. There was the president of a trade association. I did a keynote for them a couple of weeks back, and he was telling me about his daughter, who was in her 20s, who was invited to be part of the interviewing for her new manager. And so the CEO of the company, it was a relatively small company, CEO of the company and a couple of other people were interviewing the candidates, and she was included. And then after all the interviews, no one ever asked her opinion. So she said to the CEO, "So don't you want to know what I think?" And he feigned interest, and she gave him her feedback, and she was so offended that she quit and went to another job simply because they did not value her opinion. That's what we're dealing with here in terms of where these folks are coming from. So, and they want to be self-directed. These things are wonderful inside an agile organization, to be purpose-driven, mastery, and self-directed. If we can embed that into the culture, which we need to, particularly when you consider all the technology that's taking place, then these are huge opportunities. But here's the problem. This is human nature. People don't like change. And any of you who, and I suspect most of you, have been in an environment where you were introducing some sort of new program or product or service into a workforce, there's massive resistance unless you can get early adopters that will, in effect, smooth the way and pull some of the folks on the back end of this curve into it. You can't, if you attempt to impose or push things onto them, they'll find ways to sabotage. And so what we have to appreciate here is that while this looks like a fairly smooth curve, there's this huge chasm right here. This is not smooth. And most organizations fail when they see opportunities to do something new. The people who are in this early innovator area, they jump at every new idea. Everyone else needs to be convinced. And this is the gap that most organizations culturally don't understand, that this is not a smooth line. And now depending upon what the topic is, what the issue is, you may be back here on a topic or you may be up here. If you're talking about agility inside cultures, I'm up here in the front. If you're talking about going to go bungee jumping, I'm back here trying to sabotage. I'm trying to do something to keep us from going because I'm not interested. I'm not going. And so you can't violate this curve, but what you can do is accelerate the time it takes to get through the curve, but that's got to be a cultural dynamic that we are really going to talk about. So the other component part here to understand is that the traditional organizational structure is a huge impediment, and I'm sure there would be heads shaking absolutely, to agility. Because you can't have the information funnel up to a small group of people, they make decisions, and then funnel it back down. There's two core things that's happening. You create a bottleneck, and the other thing that on decisions, and the other thing is that you disempowered the workforce. And so they basically are sitting there fundamentally like zombies. And so I spend a fair amount of time in the Agile community, even though, as I said, I don't have a background in it. And I spent 24 years in banking with JP Morgan, and I spent 9 of those years financing private equity deals. So I was spending time with some of the top management and investors in the country, and they always was talking about what that organization's sustainable competitive advantage was. What's the sustainable competitive advantage of the organization? In the 21st century, there's really, in my view, only one sustainable competitive advantage, and that is agility. And that's because of all the changes that are taking place, no product, service, market position, or intellectual property can you assume will have anything that looks like a dominant market position over the long term. There's too much taking place. There's too many creative people out there. There's too much technology that can throw you through that can throw a monkey wrench in what you're doing. And so as a result, agility is the key. And we're sitting here with a bunch of agilists. So doesn't that sound like a huge opportunity for the Agile community to introduce this into the larger culture of the organizations that you sit in? And I would say it is a huge opportunity, but the problem is that you don't speak the same language as the business people. Agilists tend to talk about epics and features and stories and release trains. And business people tend to talk about revenue, cash flow, market share, profitability. And why can't you just call it a meeting instead of a stand-up? Or why can't you call it a debrief instead of a retrospective? So they're like, we don't even know what the heck you guys are talking about. And so while the Agilist should be a huge opportunity to penetrate the entire organization, I find in terms of the folks I'm talking to that I'm one of the people who can translate agility speak into business speak. And so there is like where the huge opportunity is in terms of the culture transcending into the larger organization. I want to take a minute here real fast and give you a little bit of background on me and my firm because I just think it's relevant to this whole thing. As I said, I spent 24 years at JP Morgan, and I've been doing full-time coaching for the last 12 years, strictly talking to business owners and C-suites, never talking to technology people, with this focus around agility. And I was actually having a conversation with the head of marketing at ASPE, who is one of our sponsors, and I was talking to him about cultural agility, and his eyes got big. He says, "Oh, do you know all about Agile?" And I'm like, "No, Scrum and SAFe," and I'd never heard of any of this stuff. And so long story short, he said, there's this program we want to develop, and it was called, at the time, it was called IC Agile Talent. Now it's called Agile HR. And so they asked me if I developed a course. And so I developed one of the first courses in the Western Hemisphere on what's now called Agile Human Resources. And through my exposure to them, I then also became aware of a group called Xscale Alliance. And so I'm a member of a business agility coaching fraternity. And so it's still a bunch of Agilists, like the majority of people that are in this program, but they're actively attempting to figure out how to move the agility conversation into the C-suite. This is just my firm sort of, we kind of go from Fortune 100 companies on down to emerging growth companies. I want to bring this little piece up here because I think it's very relevant to where I'm headed. We do a lot of behavioral analysis. We use a firm called TTI Success Insights, as well as research. And the reason why I bring these up, and it'll become clear in a couple of slides, is that we're not using the technology that's available to help us understand people. And if you are not using the technology that helps you understand people, how do you expect to become as effective in terms of teaming, communicating, collaborating, and being innovative? And so I think that's very important. I've got, you probably noticed, there's a bunch of PhDs that are part of my team, and so they do a lot of research, and that's really what that point is. I almost probably shouldn't put those in there, but I'm thinking about it. Okay, so now let's talk about, so what does cultural agility mean in the age of generational and technological disruption? And what it really means is that you have to leverage all the resources that you have at your disposal. Okay, and that we're going to identify some really key source spots with some data here in a slide or two. There are 4 or 5 concepts of agility from a cultural perspective that I'm going to talk about for the remainder of my time. and these are them. The idea that Agile culture requires that the company be people-centric, that you are an ecosystem thinker, that you use a concept called leadership as a service, which is a step beyond servant leadership, and that autonomy and alignment of the organization and the people, and then this notion of reducing hierarchy, which is what we call descaling. Okay, so on this people-centric side is really quite simple. Or all organizations, including agile ones, I have found struggle with putting the right people in the right position with the right skills, with the authority to act. And even though the first value of agile is people over processes, I find that most frameworks have very tight processes and actually make it quite a bit of a challenge to get potentially high talent people into positions, because it's all driven by subjective measures, your title, your relationship to the person making the decision, what your resume says. And you frequently don't give considerations to other people with talents that maybe aren't quite as obvious, or simply rotating or doing something that broadens the talent base and the potential of the organization. And so in these next couple of slides, I'm going to provide you with some data-driven analysis that will validate some of the lost opportunities that organizations, be they operating with agility or not, are missing, and how these need to be a core part of the culture. Okay, so I mentioned the fact that we use data analysis. And as a matter of fact, my partner and I have done over 11,000 behavioral analysis assessments on people, with most of them having been done by him. Let me quickly say that. Amongst the analysis that we do is looking at competencies. You could also interchange the word skill, okay? And so this organization, and their little logos down here, TTI Success Insights, best in class developer of behavioral assessments, has identified 25 key competencies that are necessary for high performance. And so I'm just going to tab through these, and I want you to see some of the things. I think you would logically say, yes, it would be really great for individuals and certainly for a team of people to possess these sets of skills in terms of the development of a high performing team, a high performing organization. And so, yes.
Can I interrupt you for a moment? You have a question from Rochelle asking if you could further explain leadership as a service versus servant leadership.
I will absolutely explain it. It's coming up. It's probably my third or fourth example, but yes, it's a core part of the culture. I want to start with people, and then I'm going to work my way through fundamentally on this order. Okay, so people-centric ecosystem, leadership as a service will be the third topic I cover. Okay. So we had a client, and we gave the workforce an assessment that looked at these competencies. And then I grafted these competencies onto a chart, and I'm going to show that chart to you right now. So this is a workforce that had a fairly well-rounded set of competencies here, with customer focus being very high. But this is a good set of competencies. And again, this is what the data said the skill set was. Then we did some perception mapping. We went to their managers, and that were plant managers, and we said, we want you on a scale of 0 to 100, tell us what are the competencies that you most want your workforce to possess. And this is what the manager said that they valued out of the workforce. So they really were in love with customer focus, problem solving, leadership, and along here, but did not value nor require that this workforce did anything around being creative, appreciating others, managing conflicts, understanding, continuous learning. Did not care, no interest in it, okay? And then we asked the workforce, so what do you think your employer is looking for from you in your job? And this is what they said. They understood customer focus and problem solving and leadership were important. They thought that they needed a few other skills, but generally speaking, they said, the boss doesn't care whether or not I think creatively or futuristically or think conceptually. I don't either. So this is what I would describe as the zombie environment, in particular of the boomer and the Gen X generation, where there's a job description, you do the job, you don't think about anything other than that job, and you go on home at the end of the day. But from the point of view of leveraging the resources of the organization, why would you ever pay money and not use all this talent? Look at the talent that is being wasted by the organization. And I'm telling you point blank, culturally, you're not going to be competitive in an environment with the sort of changes that are taking place. The workforce won't change. The millennials and the Gen Z won't tolerate it. And the technology, somebody's going to come along because you're not leveraging your resources in anything that looks like a meaningful way. And so to me, these are the sorts of things that we have to do. And I share this because if I go back to the slide about the unwillingness to change, and if you look at the structural dynamic of hierarchy, which basically says, I've given you a job description, you just do it, and I'm not asking you to think. You begin to look at this in financial officers inside an organization, CEOs inside organizations will start to say, man, that doesn't make any sense. We need to think instead of job descriptions, maybe we need responsibility descriptions. We need to think more broadly about how we use our workforce. And so what we then introduce is the notion of dynamic thinking to the entire workforce. Okay, so I'm still on the people-centric side of this. Now that we realize we've got all this talent, we need to help them to understand how to think in a different way, the entire organization to think in a different way. And it really comes down to these three boxes: human needs, technological feasibility, and business viability. And what we're looking for is a new way of thinking where people-centric, where you use the talents of the people to imagine, envision, and identify new ways to solve problems. Okay, so you suddenly unlock all this talent and ask them to think creatively, ask them to solve problems real time, but they can't do that if they don't know what it is the problem is. And that leads us into ecosystem thinking. And so we need organizations to bring the entire workforce into what in the heck are we, why are we here? I mean, if you were to go to your employee and people you work with and ask them, what is the purpose of your job? How does this job tie to what our company does? Why is your job or our team's activities relevant? And how does it connect to the people who are over the other side of the floor or in a different building? How does it all fit together? And so this is an opportunity to finally say and to articulate, and for organizations to live the mission and to articulate the purpose. And it's so interesting that our keynote this morning talked a lot about purpose. You have to bring that purpose to the individual and the team, which is what I call line of sight. I've got to be able to connect what I do to why this organization exists. If you want millennials and Gen Z to work for your organization and to thrive inside your organization, you have to do that. And once you understand that, it opens up, well, here are the new skills I need. These are the capabilities I need to begin to develop, either individually or as a team. This particular slide I did for a community here in North Carolina. I live in North Carolina, and it's an attempt to have a community to stop thinking in terms of silos, but to recognize the fact that there are interconnecting parts that play a huge role in the success and the viability of communities. And we find repeatedly that everybody's siloed in their thinking. For those of you in the state of North Carolina, the single best example of ecosystem thinking in this state is the Research Triangle Park. So RTP is a huge economic engine for this region. It spans 3 counties. It involves multiple municipalities. It has engaged several universities and businesses in the development and all that's happening there. It is really just an example using a community of what all of our organizations should be doing. How does the finance staff interact with the marketing staff, interact with the production team, interact with the customer service group, and how does all that fit back to the purpose of the organization? And so these are really the key kind of compelling concepts here. And so when I say ecosystem thinking, I just want to clarify for everybody more so what I'm talking about, because this is really creating a competition of ideas. I believe that's a term that Steve Jobs might have coined. He was very much interested in having the best ideas come to the forefront. They didn't have to be his. As a matter of fact, there's nothing better than I'll take a step back here for a second and say, you know, I had a client that was hiring somebody into his organization, and one of the questions he asked me was, how did I feel about the idea of hiring somebody that was smarter than him, because he really thought that this candidate had a heck of a lot more skills than he did. And my response was, my goal is for everybody that works for me to be smarter than me, and I still get a chance to make the decision. Now that's an old mindset of I get a chance to make the decision. At the time, that made a lot of sense. But today, what we really want is for everybody to, in effect, be focused on putting the best ideas on the table. And so to be an ecosystem thinker really is to think breadth first and to have all stakeholders work as peers. And I highlight the word all stakeholders and peers, because this is not about the person with the highest paid opinion wins. It's not about the person who has the title winning. This is about having everybody think broadly about the organization. And I had a client did some work in December. A new CEO got hired into a fairly significant nonprofit organization. The former CEO had been there 19 years. The new CEO came in with great ideas, but the fundamental attitude of his senior leadership team was, we've always done it this way. And so therefore, why should we do it a different way? And so he needed to get buy-in from the entire team. And so we in effect took the team into a day-long exercise in developing a 10-year strategic vision for the organization, which they then backed down into a mission, which they then backed down into projects that they all agreed on. And so, you know, this notion of the CEO taking a step back and instead of saying, this is what we're going to do, allowing the senior leadership team to evolve that and for them all to create that line of sight between them and the mission was critical. Learning and sharing has to become part of the culture. If you're going to do ecosystem thinking, it's not a one-shot deal where, okay, we all got together in a room, we agree on what we're going to do, and then we never talk about it anymore. There's got to be a dynamic loop of learning, and I will share that and how we go about doing that in a couple of slides as well. Operating in small cross-functional teams, that doesn't require any understanding on the part of you all. That's the way you all operate it in the Agile environment. Align teams into self-managing value streams. I'm presuming that fundamentally that's clear. You know, teams ultimately, a group of teams becomes a stream, okay? And you give them a lot of self-direction. It's a given to satisfy customer demands, but it's remarkable how frequently that is not what organizations focus on. It's a given that you need to share resources. And then this notion of mercilessly improving and refining things to make things simpler is key. Embracing creativity and smart risk taking. Again, our keynote this morning, I spent a time talking about risk taking, or he called it experimentation. That was how he described it. You had to experiment, having babies in the workforce, in the workplace, I think was one of his examples. But we've got to be able to embrace that. And then finally, we got to identify opportunities to serve underdeveloped markets. And frequently these markets don't even exist, but they're underserved. Who knew that that there was an underserved market for people had bedrooms and basements that they could rent out, a la Airbnb? Who knew people were sitting on automobiles that they rarely use, and so therefore they found another revenue stream, a la Uber? You know, Uber is the largest transportation company in the world and doesn't own any automobiles, and Airbnb is the largest hospitality company in the world and doesn't own any hotel beds. So these are where ecosystem thinking can take you to a very different place. So we talked about the need for the people to be leveraged and exploited. I'm using that term in the most positive way because people want to have challenging and interesting work to do. We've talked about the fact that we need to have the whole board view and this ecosystem perspective and what that looks like. But now we've got to deal with the managers. Okay, now we've got to deal with the mindset of the leadership and how are we going to get them through that bell-shaped curve whereby they can see where this is beneficial to them. And so this is what I call the new role for leadership, and I coined the term leadership as a service. And so here's just some basic facts. We now have a new ROI. In the financial world, I worked at JP Morgan, that would be typically return on investment. But what we're really talking about in an agile cultural organization is a return on intelligence. That is what is got to be key. The leaders have to shift from being the expert to being the facilitator. This is because there's too much information flowing through organizations for a small group of people at the top to know it. So the leadership has to go from knowing it all and feeling the need to know it all to sharing it all and insisting that that information be shared broadly and dynamically through organizations. And so leadership's focus should be on the development of their people. We know there's talent there that's untapped. And then culturally, how do you create an organization with all the proper structures whereby agility is possible? And you really have to get there by using 21st century technology versus 19th century approaches. And again, a 19th century approach is your resume, how do I feel about you, you know, who referred you to me, what's the last thing you did, versus, hey, what is some sort of objective sort of analysis that can be added to the objective can be added to the subjective to allow us to be able to perform at a different level and also use whole board thinking. And so let me take another step here in terms of what do I mean by leadership as a service. And in the short period of time I've got, and obviously we're going to be finishing in a couple of slides, I'm happy to talk more about it. But in its simplest form, in a leadership as a service environment, the leader stops being the bottleneck. Let's take a step back on what I've talked about so far. Teams know what to do now because they have gotten an ecosystem perspective. They have line of sight in terms of what their job or their team's responsibility is within the context of the overall goals that the organization is attempting to do. So therefore, conceptually, that team should be able to go forward with its projects. And so long as they have unanimous agreement as to what they're doing, there should be really no need for leadership involvement from a decision-making point of view. But on those occasions when they can't agree, and so then they in effect come to their leader / manager and they say, look, this is the project, this is the problem, and we don't agree. Instead of the leader making the decision, what the leader does is they decide who decides. So they listen to the arguments and they say, Betty, Sue, Jane, you appear to have the best perspective on this particular topic. I'm going to let you decide how the team or the group goes forward. Now, if you're doing your retrospectives and your stand-ups and you're doing this regular communicative dynamic, if that decision does not generate positive outcomes, you may be back at the leader again to have that conversation, but you have engaged the employee, you have engaged the workforce, you've had them come to you with the facts, and let's understand something. They should be better equipped to know what's right versus you because you're a step away from it. So you decide the decider, and then if that particular group has a group under them, you perpetuate that through the organization. The CEO under this scenario would never make a decision. Okay. The CEO would never be, he's always going to pick somebody based on the teams to decide what should happen. You have engaged the people in a very different way. For this to work, you have to elevate accountability, designate directly responsible people. You've got to be relentless around those sorts of processes, okay? And you have to remove the obstacles to the team's success. Those obstacles could be training. The obstacle could be somebody inside, outside the organization is not being cooperative. We don't know what it is, but leadership as a service is serving the team so that they can do the work because they're closest to what it is that needs to happen. And so you really want to leverage the talents and the technologies. And so they should know exactly what we're dealing with here. Okay, so now we're really left with alignment and with descaling. And I want to talk about organizational structures here for a minute. I don't know who here is familiar with General Stanley McChrystal. He wrote a book called Team of Teams. General McChrystal was in charge of the US's war on terror. And when he was assigned the task, the organizational structure inside his group looked like this, very hierarchical in a traditional leadership style. The problem was they were getting their butts kicked, okay, because their enemy was agile. They were small groups. They were operating independently. There was no structure, and so this command and control structure kept the decisions were coming back and coming up the line and back down the line too slowly, and so therefore they were not having an impact. McChrystal evolved over time to an environment that initially looked like this and ultimately looked like this one here at the bottom. And it was kind of fascinating because what they would do is he would invite everybody in to the meetings, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the Treasury Department, anybody that might have some sort of impact. The Navy SEALs would be sitting next to the Army Rangers, I mean, that sort of thing. And they would share everything that had happened the day before. And people would take the information McChrystal shared and they would take it back to their little fiefdom silo and wouldn't offer up any insights until finally somebody started connecting the dots. And it kind of confirmed A, that there weren't any leaks, and B, that by sharing and collaborating, that they had a significantly better ecosystem perspective on what was happening because they were looking at the whole board instead of individual boards. And so all of a sudden, the alignment of people became very different. They did it based upon needs because they understood the entire mission and they understood clearly what the enemy was doing. And so how do you take this and apply it to what I'm talking about? So we're all familiar in the Agile community with the notion of there being teams. And in this scenario, just to be sure we're all on the same page, teams, which in my environment is no more than 6 people, turns into streams. And then streams roll up into portfolios, okay? Chapters are opportunities for subject matter experts that are all in the same discipline to get together and have conversations. And then guilds are ideas or challenges or opportunities where, hey, we're looking at cost cutting and who wants to come and talk about cost cutting, so people get together around mutual interests or maybe it's some sort of new technology. And so these teams and these squads and these portfolios interact and align themselves with agreements, or we also call them treaties. Now, here's where the descaling part plays out here, because what we do is, from a cultural point of view, is we create council meetings. And so imagine that you've got a group of teams that get together to talk about their alignment. We rotate the people that come to the stream coordination meeting, so it's not always the same person. So in effect, literally no one is in charge. So if there's 6 people in each team, they would rotate, and so there would be a 6-person council meeting. So 2 people from each team would be, assuming there were 3 squads or teams together, they would meet as a stream, and there'd be 2 from each group. And then the next time that they met, one of those people would be new. So there'd be some level of continuity, but then there wouldn't be, but they'd also get these fresh ideas. And then you just take that up another level and up another level. and you keep this rotating because you are engaged in the entire organization and learning. You're leveraging all the talents of all the people that are inside, and you are keeping engagement, and you are bubbling up ideas in a very dynamic way. Now, that all sounds really interesting and cool. Somebody's probably saying, but I'll never get my boss to do that. I'll never get my organization to do that. And so when we've been successful in doing this, we have introduced people to a game. And it's called Game Without Thrones, play on the TV show. But since the TV show is getting out of date, it's also called Zero Command and Control. And what we do is we have the group, and we've had groups as large as 160 people who did not know each other just come together. We've actually done meetups. You know, hey, come and you want to build a castle. And we have them come to build a castle, okay? And so we explain to them what it is they need to do, and it's a 3-hour process, okay? So that you don't do this overnight. We recently did it with the senior leadership team of an Ecuadorian bank. And so they build castles.
There's
And
a 5-minute check, just letting you know.
thank you. And they build castles, okay? And we've done these all over the world. And what's really important to understand here is that we put people in teams. Those teams will roll up into squads. They go into their chapter meetings. They come back. They talk about how to integrate the castle, and at the end of the time, the CEO had no more authority, the senior vice president had no more authority than anyone else in terms of the building of the castle, and at the end of the day, they built the castle. So they said, you know what, I don't have to tell everybody what to do in order for us to be successful. And so this is really very much how we kind of break the cultural divide. And so in terms of embracing the disruption of the next 20 years, you got to do what makes sense. And that's, I think, critical and key. Do what makes sense. Got to think breadth first. You have to exploit the resources, create entrepreneurs, and use the language of business, and figure out some people who can translate the language of business. And I just want to emphasize the fact that you got to use data. And there hasn't been a major winner in any of the major sports franchises that has not embraced the use of data. And it's just time for business to do the same thing. And so that's the story. I'm so sorry at some level that we weren't all in the same room, but I think it's really cool. And I guess we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Darsweil, thank you. Does anyone have any questions in the last 3 minutes?
And I will go over to Slack, by the way, after this if people have questions.
All right, so Darsweil, thank you so much for presenting at Tri-Agile 2020, and thank you everyone for attending. Take a moment to provide feedback on the session via the session on Sketch, and please continue the conversation in the Tri-Agile 2020 Slack channel. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.